Hello, MCU fans! Today's going to be my breakdown and review of Eyes of Wakanda, including Easter eggs, timeline, and yes, that crazy time travel in Episode 4. So, there will be spoilers for all the episodes, but as long as you're okay with that, then let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have an August contest running all month long. Be a subscriber and leave a comment. You could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And that means we need to announce our July winner, which is the Lorekeeper 77, with this comment on the Fantastic Four comic breakdown. So, Lorekeeper, reach out to me on the About section of my channel, either via Discord or email, and I'll get you your prize right away. Also, we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, and hang around to the end of the video, and I'll talk about the Doomsday Countdown rewatch on the Discord. All right, so let's start things off by talking about the timeline placement poll, where I asked folks where do they think it's going to show up on Disney+. Most of the answers were before Captain America: The First Avenger, and it turns out they were right. It is indeed now the first entry in the complete timeline. Isn't that wild to have something in the timeline before Captain America: The First Avenger? Obviously, it also showed up in Marvel Animation and the MCU Multiverse Saga. All right, so before we get into the breakdown of the episodes, I want to talk a little bit about what we learned in Black Panther and Wakanda Forever. You remember there were 5 tribes that settled on the land and called it Wakanda. The 4 tribes lived to learn under the king's rule, and they included the Merchant Tribe, the Border Tribe, the River Tribe, and the Mining Tribe. And keep those in mind because we're going to get some call-outs to them in the episodes. And then, of course, there was the Jabari Tribe, and they wanted to isolate themselves in the mountains. All right, so the first Black Panther was named Bashenga. We actually learned that in Wakanda Forever, that he was the first Black Panther. And then we learned about the War Dogs. Of course, they originally came from the comics, but then we also saw in Wakanda Forever that the princess has been brought home by the war dog Nakia, confirming that, yep, Nakia is indeed a war dog. And we learned in the Black Panther movie that T'Challa's uncle took a war dog assignment in America, and while he was on that assignment, he decided that our people suffer because they don't have the tools to fight back. So here we see the war dogs rebelling against the wishes of Wakanda once they get into the outside world, and of course we'll see that in the episodes. But this all leads to Killmonger and his revenge quest. It can all be traced back to the war dogs, and of course to that infamous vibranium axe that we see in the Black Panther movie and will definitely be coming up in the episodes. Of course, we see that Killmonger's plan is to send the vibranium weapons to the war dogs in the outside world, and that they will arm oppressed people all over the world. So honestly, after watching the Black Panther movie, I didn't have a real good impression of the war dogs. I mean, many of them seem to be like traitors, but I'm glad this series definitely changed my opinion of them. And of course, we see that Killmonger's quest ultimately resulted in Wakanda opening itself to the outside world, sharing their knowledge and resources. All right, so now let's talk about the episodes, and I really liked this mission map they showed us as part of the promo materials. So episode 1 happens in Crete in 1260 BC, episode 2 is in Troy in 1200 BC, then we jump all the way to 1400 AD in China, and we finally end up in 1896 AD in Ethiopia, Adwa in particular. All right, so episode 1 is Crete in 1260 BC, which they tell us here with the graphic, and we meet the ruler known as the Lion. Of course, he has a lot of chief lieutenants that we meet, and that includes a Middle Eastern blade master, a Viking shield maiden, a Samoan warrior, and finally a Ronin swordsman. So he was actually uniting many parts of the world together under his rule. And we also see that he has a legion of loyal fighters, although many of them probably brainwashed, as we'll see later. And then we meet Noni, and turns out she is not a helpless victim, as she says, "No one is my master." So then we jump back 6 weeks earlier to learn why Noni was there in Crete. Turns out she's a member of the Merchant Tribe, remember those were the 5 tribes, and that she was removed from the Dora Milaje. But then we see she's given a chance at redemption as she's tasked with retrieving the stolen Wakandan items, the ones that the Lion took off with. Fleeing the kingdom was betrayal enough, but this renegade also took dozens of dangerous items with him. So now she is tasked with returning them. So then we do indeed see that the Lion is creating a cult-like following. Noni accuses the Shield Maiden of pretending to re-educate these women as you lead them into a life of slavery, and her response is they will be grateful in the end to know their divine purpose. Oh my, that is just really, really creepy. And then we learn that the Lion himself was once a war dog. He says in ancient times, agents like me were known as the Hatut Zirazi, but now they call themselves war dogs. A secret network of spies sent out across the world to do missions that Wakanda does not want known. Okay, so I guess that gives me a little bit better impression of the war dogs. They're not all evil, right? But this one is. In fact, in the battle with Noni, she is badly injured. Ouch, that looks really painful. But ultimately, the Lion decides to take his own life. He says, "We'll both be forgotten, but at least I will have lived free." And that sounds very similar to what Killmonger said before he took his own life. He said, "My ancestors knew death was better than bondage." Wow, the parallels are amazing. So then we see the massive explosion the lion creates, and that results in Noni being unable to retrieve some of the stolen items. That includes the vibranium axe, and I think also includes the necklace that we're going to see showing up in the next episode on Helen of Troy. So Noni returns to Wakanda, very frustrated she was unable to complete her task, and says, "Let me retrieve what has been stolen from us for as long as it takes." And thus, she is welcomed in to become a war dog. And I can't help but notice this eye patch and think, my goodness, that has to be an homage to Nick Fury. And in fact, we'll see more reasons why I think that when we get to the second episode. Speaking of, episode 2, that takes place in Troy in 1200 BC. Now, interestingly enough, they did not give us a graphic telling us that, so we have to then go to the promo materials, but definitely it tells us it's happening in 1200 BC in Troy, so 60 years after the previous episode. So what we get in this episode is the MCU's version of the Trojan War. And in fact, we have all the usual players. We have Odysseus, we of course have the warrior Achilles, we have Paris and Helen of Troy herself, and of course Agamemnon, or Memnon as he's referred to in the episode. Now Memnon is a trusted companion of Achilles. In fact, they talk about the fact they've been together for 9 years, and Memnon even says, "Someone has to be here to put the coins on your eyes for the ferrymen," referring to the fact that you put 2 coins on a dead person's eyes so that Charon will carry them across the river Styx. Of course, Rio's going, "Wait, you get paid to do this? No one told me. No one told me." Too funny. Anyway, we then learn that Memnon isn't quite who he seems to be. He's actually Bakai, a war dog on a mission. He's trying to retrieve that necklace that Helen is wearing, which again I believe is one of the items we saw Noni unable to recover there in that first episode. All right, so we see that the first battle doesn't go as planned, and I love the fact that Bakai literally has a vibranium spritzer that he uses to heal his hand, very similar to how the Kamoyo bead was used to heal Ross in the Black Panther movie. All right, so then we see it's time to bring out the old reliable Trojan horse trick. I mean, it would not be a Trojan war without a Trojan horse, right? And that's so much better than the Trojan bunny that we saw in Monty Python's Holy Grail. Oh my goodness, that movie is so funny. If you've never seen it, you gotta watch it. Anyway, Memnon/Bakai does indeed get his prize, but in the process, Achilles feels very betrayed. And in fact, they end up in a fierce battle, and sure enough, he pays the ultimate price. Ooh, that was painful, right in the Achilles heel. And then we see that Bakai does indeed place the coins on Achilles as he's taken to his final resting place. So then we jump to 6 months later, and we see Bakai meeting with Director Noni. So once again, another reason why I feel like she's a reference to, Director Fury and the eye patch. But anyway, Bakai says, "I gave a decade of my life to Wakanda, and while he wants to return to the field, he's not quite sure of his path ahead." So I was really hoping we'd get to see more of this character. I wonder if in the future we'll learn what ended up happening to him. That would be nice. That would be really nice. All right, so on to episode number 3, which takes place in China in 1400 AD, meaning we have jumped almost 3,000 years since the last episode. So we see that Agent Basha is on a mission to retrieve an artifact, and we learn that the artifact is actually a vibranium tongue in this ancient statue. Unfortunately, he can't get the tongue out, so he has to take the statue with him, or at least a portion of it. So then Basha then takes off on a flight, believing his mission to be a success. And isn't it crazy to think the Wakandans discovered flight like centuries before the Wright brothers? Wild. That's just wild. So all right, once he returns to Wakanda, he admires the view, and I love that he says, "I never tire of this view," because that totally reminded me of T'Challa saying this never gets old as he flew into Wakanda in the first Black Panther movie. All right, so then we see that the artifacts retrieved in earlier episodes are here as well. There's the necklace that was worn by Helen of Troy, and there's the mask that was worn by the lion. So that's really cool. So then we find out that there was indeed a stowaway on Basha's ship, and it turns out it was an Iron Fist, and she was awesome in this episode. So her name is Jirani, and we see that she rescued Basha from the blizzard, and this reminds me so much of the monks rescuing Danny Rand from a blizzard and taking him in. And then I love her response when she's found out. In Mandarin, she drops maybe an F-bomb? I don't know. I don't know Mandarin. Somebody else will have to tell me, but that was awesome. So then we see a battle ensuing on what I'm imagining are an earlier version of the maglev trains, the magnetic levitation trains. So we see them fighting away, and I don't know how they were able to stand up on these without getting blown off, but I think these are like an earlier version of what we saw in the Black Panther, where they had their big fight on the maglev trains. So then we learn the artifact was stolen from Wakanda 1,000 years ago. And honestly, that surprised me because I assumed it was stolen as part of the stuff that the lion took way back in episode 1, but that was nearly 3,000 years ago. So I guess things have been stolen several times from Wakanda. That's not good. Then we learn Jirani's origin as she explains she defeated the dragon to become Iron Fist. I defeated the immortal dragon Shao-Lao, and I drew the power from his molten heart, and I am Iron Fist. Now, I was a little surprised because I thought they would tie her character into the one we heard about in Iron Fist Season 2, Wooshi, because we learned that she was the first woman to defeat the dragon. Her name was Wooshi, and we know her as the Pirate Queen of Pinghai Bay. So maybe we'll learn more about how these two Iron Fists fit together if Colleen ever returns. Please bring Colleen back. I loved her character so much. All right, so Jirani actually solves the whole issue by removing the vibranium from the statue so they can keep the vibranium and she can take her statue back. And I do love the fact that her fist looks so similar to how they portrayed Danny Rand's Iron Fist in his series. So then as the episode winds down, we get a nice shout out for Bast. What in Bast's name happened here? Of course, we met her in Thor Love and Thunder. And this excuse sounds really familiar because they say that it was all a training exercise, right? Where have we heard that before? Love that line from Iron Man 1, an unfortunate training exercise. And then finally, we get a nice shout out for the first Black Panther when Bashi says that Ebo stood his ground like Bashenga Reborn. And remember, we learned Bashenga's name in Wakanda Forever. All right, so finally we move to episode 4, which is 1896 in Ethiopia's city of Adwa. So we meet Tafari and Kuda, who are on a dangerous mission. In fact, there's an all-out war going on around them. Kuda says, "We were outfitted for infiltration, not conflict. Certainly not at this level. We must abort the mission for now." Which is interesting, because had they actually aborted the mission and left that vibranium axe alone, everything would have been fine. But Tafari's not good at taking orders, and he sneaks in and retrieves the vibranium axe. He says, I got it. Kuda is very upset at him for not following orders, but he says it's the nature of a war dog to walk their own path, not the one set out for them. Now that's really interesting, considering that ultimately they're going to have to walk a different path than the one they thought was set out for them because they're going to have to return the axe. That's kind of wild, right? But anyway, that's what director Noni, the first war dog to ever recover one of Wakanda's missing artifacts, said. So this ties us back into episode 1. I really like how all 4 episodes really connect well. So then it looks like something big's about to happen because you know who is peeking in from the sky above. In fact, we've been seeing him everywhere, right? We saw him in I Am Groot. We saw him in X-Men 97. We saw him in your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The dude just gets around. He's a busy, busy man. But that means something big is going down. But first we get a reference to another one of the tribes. I wanted to ride along with the legendary Kuda of the mining tribe, not whoever this is. So I love the fact they keep tying everyone back to their tribes. And then a new threat appears before them, this armored warrior. And I love how they basically tag team her from each side. In fact, the way they initially fought her reminded me a lot of another famous tag teaming of an armored foe. So yeah, pretty cool callback, I thought. So that's when we learn the bad news. The intruder explains that 500 years from now, so basically in the 2300s, Wakanda is just a graveyard because it is attacked by the Horde. They came from the edge of the galaxy, and they are nasty looking, right? I mean, look at those things. Nasty insect-looking creatures, and they shoot lava out of their mouth, I guess? I really can't tell what they're doing there. I just know I don't want to get hit by that, because that looks painful. So then we learn that the nations of the earth united to fight them, except for one nation who could have made a difference. Wakanda's laws dictate that we cannot help outsiders. So right here, this is our first big hint that something strange is going on, right? Because we learned at the end of Black Panther that Wakanda did decide to help outsiders. So there's definitely something strange going on. But anyway, she then introduces herself as the Queen of Wakanda, the last Black Panther. Then she explains that they have something called a quantum scanner that in peaceful times was used to study history, which actually that is using real science because there have been theories that we're going to figure out how to use some type of a quantum scanner to at least view the past, not to alter it, but at least to view it. So that's pretty cool. So they then decided to set out to find the link that led to their doomed future. How did they get to this place? And they want to break it. So she starts showing these images that unfortunately have a lot of Wakanda writing on it, and we really need to translate it, right? But that's okay, because we do have the Wakanda alphabet. All right, so if we translate it all, in the upper left-hand corner it says acquired, and then we learn it's the Lion Mask Modified Combat Helmet Destroyer class. Of course, that's the thing they acquired back in episode 1. But notice the year, 0502 7546? What on earth? Well, keeping in mind that that was 1260 BC, then it seems that maybe they're using a different origin point for numbering their years. So if we add 1260 to 7546, we get about 8800 BC, which sort of aligns to the birth of Wakanda, because that's 8000 BC. So maybe that's what they were going for and didn't do the math right. I don't know. I would love to know what on earth this year means. So tell me your thoughts in the comments. But then also notice in the lower right, Temporal Recon 005. All right, so then we move to the next item. That's the Trojan Pennant 12th Gen V capacitor. That was retrieved in episode 2. The year is now 7590, and it's Temporal Recon 34. So next is the Tongue of Shaolao V-Metal Fan Blade. Notice the year is now 10,905. My word. And the Temporal Recon is 209. And then finally they discover the issue. It's the Benin Axe V-Metal Hammer Blade Field Weapon Component. Now notice the year is 11,369, and then I think this is maybe a typo because it's Temporal Recon 005 once again, so probably a cut and paste error. But what I really like about this is Benin Axe, so they're referring to it being Benin. Well, that matches what was said in the Black Panther movie, that the axe was also from Benin, 7th century. So very nice attention to detail there. Okay, so she explains that that axe, it's the perfect hinge point that, if restored, could set everything right. And it all begins when a forgotten son of Wakanda finds the axe. So that leads to a cascading of events where Killmonger finds the axe, attacks Wakanda, and Wakanda opens its doors to the rest of the world. So, with the world united, the future Black Panther theorizes, the Horde invasion will be defeated. And then she says something crazy. She says, once the axe is returned, my timeline will realign with this one and will rewrite everything the Horde has done. Okay, wait a minute. We got to go back to that. My timeline will realign with this one. That is a mouthful, because that's saying she's not from this timeline, and that by fixing their timeline, it will cause hers to realign with this one and rewrite everything the Horde has done. All right, so let's see if we can make sense of this. So I think what the episode is saying is that originally the Sacred Timeline in 1896 had a situation where that axe was removed, and that led to trickle-down effects where in the 2300s all hell broke loose and the Horde attacked and everybody died. So then there must have been a branched timeline sometime after 1896 where this last Black Panther, as she calls herself, exists. The reason I'm saying it has to be a branch is she talked about her timeline being different than the one she's visiting in the episode. Okay, so she says, hey, I'm going to go back to 1896 and I'm going to convince them you need to return the axe, which we're going to see that in just a minute. And that resulted in the much happier Sacred Timeline that we actually saw, throughout the MCU. And that causes a trickle-down effect that her branch timeline, because it occurs after 1896, is also fixed. Oh my word, that's crazy, right? Now I think what Hulk said in Endgame is still fine, because she didn't actually alter her timeline. She actually went to the Sacred Timeline to alter that, if you will, and tell them to do something different, which resulted in a trickle-down effect to her timeline. And of course, they couldn't do that in Endgame because they were already on the Sacred Timeline. So they had no choice but to create the branches that we see in that movie. This is also pretty crazy because this is all happening while the loom is in place. This is prior to Loki's tree being created because this is 1896. So that means He Who Remains actually configured the Sacred Timeline to have a horrible future, which is then fixed by the last Black Panther coming from the branch timeline and telling them what to do in 1896. Oh my word. This is insanity, right? It's insanity. Well, anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about all this. I'm just trying to make sense of it. I have no idea if I'm right or if I'm wrong. This is why I hate time travel stories. They're so painful. Anyway, we now learn the quantum window is collapsing. The chronal sync is in fatal collapse, and the quantum window is closing. So she vanishes back to the future. And in fact, it's a very dim-looking future because now the Horde has found them in their location. And once again, she talks about different timelines. She says we have to close the passage to keep them out of that timeline, right? She's referring to it as a separate timeline because we cannot let the Horde invade their time too. All right, so then back in 1896, the axe must be returned or all is lost. And the last Black Panther is saying if they have faith enough to believe what I have told them, then we must have faith that they will find a way to succeed. And sure enough, Tafari does succeed. He returns the axe into the clock, and thus the course of the sacred timeline is now changed, and we have the happier future that we see throughout all of the MCU. Meanwhile, I'm not sure what happened to their timeline, because we have the last Black Panther screaming Wakanda forever, and then we see everything go white. So did her timeline end up getting erased after all, or was this just a way of saying that her timeline has now been realigned to the sacred timeline and her branch is now the happier future? Oh man, oh man. All right, so we now see Tafari and Kuda dealing with everything that has happened. They discuss the fact they've never returned home empty-handed before, and how do we know any of this was worth it? Well, they're never going to know for sure, but they do go back and explain that whatever remains of the axe was destroyed with the rest of the city. So basically, they lie, but that allows the axe to be discovered by Killmonger in the future. And then they say, I just wish I could see the future we fought for, or at least know how long it will take to come to pass. But we have the advantage of seeing that Killmonger does indeed find that axe, and so the Black Panther movie plays out as we've seen it, resulting with them sharing their knowledge and resources and saving the future. Crazy, crazy episode, right? But I do love how they all tied together so well. So, what did you think about this series? Did I miss any Easter eggs? Do you think I even came close to explaining that time travel? I will admit, I thought these were really good, and I really enjoyed how they wrapped all the episodes together in one big story. So, leave me your thoughts. You know I love to read and respond to everything. And don't forget, we have that August contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook. And we have the membership option in case you're interested in that. And then I always love to mention the Discord. Here we are in the timeline section where I did that poll asking people to guess where things will fall in the timeline. But I'll tell you what, metaphysics is also hopping as we're trying to figure this episode out. And then I promised I would mention the Doomsday Countdown Watch on the Discord at 7 p.m. Eastern on each of the days listed here. We'll watch a different movie or show as we prepare for the December 18th, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,300 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.